And so I'd like to welcome you all to our session, Science is a Storyteller. Our speaker is Dr. Melissa Giovanni. She's a tenured professor of environmental science at the College of Southern Nevada at Las Vegas. She's also a guide for the Grand Canyon Conservancy Field Institute. In both capacities, she weaves storytelling and science to relate her subjects to the lives of her audiences. So Melissa, we're really excited that you're here. And I know you spoke at the last IATDG conference in Las Vegas and everybody raved about it. So it's great to have you back with us again. So I'm going to hand it over to you right now. And you are good to go. So whenever you're ready.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It is so cool. Well, it's good morning here in Las Vegas. It's so cool to see everyone. So I'm going to just make myself a little bigger. I can actually see all of you guys in your Brady Bunch boxes. This is my life now. I teach all of my classes on Zoom because of COVID. So this is a very familiar environment, but it was great to see you all. And thank you for joining us this morning. So yes, some of you may remember me. I saw a couple hellos in the chat. I did speak 2 years ago when the conference was in Las Vegas. So welcome back to Las Vegas. And this year I would like to talk about the Southwest and but really sort of spin what you can share with your guests when you're in the parks of the Southwest, and really using, yes, the science, but as a method of how to tell the story. So as a scientist, I can say that we are not great at telling stories. I spent 10 years of my career trying to be a research scientist and doing the publish and perish life, and it was terrible. And, we're just not great at telling stories. I've spent the last 5 years now at a community college and guiding at Grand Canyon. And I'm not going to lie, it is from guides like you and park rangers where I have learned to become a better storyteller. So a lot of this may not be terribly new to you, but I just want to thank you all for making me a better teacher and a better guide, because if you can tell a story that relates to your guests, they're going to remember it a lot better than just, oh, well, the rocks in the Grand Canyon are old. That doesn't quite, get the story across. So, down here in the Southwest, in the desert, we do have this embarrassment of riches in terms of the geologic history, phenomenal landscapes, human history, and, any story you want to tell, really, whether it's biological or environmental, all the way up into, the conservation story. How are we protecting these places? So I'm going to run through briefly sort of, what it is we have to share out here. The parks, the plateau, meaning the Colorado Plateau, the rocks themselves. I am a geologist, so we're going to talk about rocks for a minute. The people, as in the people who have always been here, the indigenous peoples of the Southwest, as well as, of course, into modern times, because there are 40 million of us that live here in the desert, which is a challenge to say the least. And then finally, what does the future hold? How can we as storytellers engage our guests who may only come out here once? How can we get them to care about these kinds of places and their stories so that they'll remember them and they'll want to be part of, the protection and the conservation going forward? So just a brief, quick slideshow. Many of you, I'm sure, have been to these places, but we have Bryce Canyon. We've got the big five in Utah, right? So we have Bryce Canyon, Capitol Reef, which is absolutely stunning, especially from the air. Zion, of course. I was just there back in September. Arches. And right next door is Canyonlands, my personal favorite, Grand Canyon, right? To say nothing of the state parks and BLM land and National Forest land that just is in this huge region that we call the Colorado Plateau. So if you're not familiar, this picture on the left, I'm not sure if you can see my mouse moving, but this region that's more or less centered around the Four Corners region, which is right here, is known as the Colorado Plateau. It is an elevated region that geologically is kind of weird. It is more or less flat line. So imagine the rocks in Grand Canyon and Zion, they're all flat line, and yet they sit at these higher elevations. I grew up in California, so the first time I went to Arizona and went to the Grand Canyon, I was shocked that I was at 7,000 feet above sea level, because I thought Arizona had like coyotes and roadrunners. Why is there snow at Grand Canyon? So a lot of people don't know that there's this elevated region in the Southwest known as the Colorado Plateau, and is really defined by this immense exposure of phenomenal geology, deeply incised by these major rivers, the main one being the Colorado River, and of course its tributaries like the San Juan and the Green River. And you get, spectacular landscapes like these pictures here, deeply incised canyons, huge freestanding arches and natural bridges, and it seems otherworldly. And so this is not really going to be a geology talk. So if you would like to go into the details of like, why is the Colorado Plateau there, hit me up afterwards. I will talk your ear off about it for as long as you can stand. But one of the cool things about the Colorado Plateau is that it preserves a rock record that is unlike anything else on Earth. Not only because it's preserved, but it's exposed. So you may have heard of the Grand Staircase. In fact, there is Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument in southern Utah as well. But the Grand Staircase is this phenomenal sequence of rocks, of which the Grand Canyon takes a big bite out of, so exposing some of the oldest rocks in North America. But that sequence marches on up northward into Utah, up until you get to Bryce Canyon and Cedar Breaks, where you're at rocks that are younger than the dinosaurs. So the amount of geologic time that is preserved and exposed in the Colorado Plateau is literally world-class. People come from all over the world to look at these rocks. And it gives us a really unique perspective. So quick side note, you can get versions of this cross-section here. I've seen it for sale in like the Zion bookstore. I'm sure you can buy it online too. I actually have one framed right here on this wall because I think it's such a beautiful work of art. I also have one laminated that I take into the field that I can show people. It's got more detail than this one. But if you find yourself, in this region of the world, it's a really useful sort of marker that allows you to see like, oh, I'm standing here on the north rim of the Grand Canyon. And when I look north, I'm actually seeing this big stack of rocks. Now, this is a lot more detailed. Don't worry that you can't see all the words. If you'd like a copy of it, I'll be happy to send it to you. But this is that entire sequence of rocks. And the reason I'm showing it to you is it's useful to put yourself in geologic context, depending on where you're standing. So again, without going into the details, this would be the sequence of rocks that are exposed in Grand Canyon. And you can then talk about, how old they are. The oldest are almost 2 billion years old. The youngest are 270, but that doesn't quite, capture people, right? It's just numbers. And what do millions of years mean anyway? Hold that thought. But at the bottom of the staircase, we've got the Grand Canyon strata. In arches and canyonlands, we kind of have this middle sequence. Zion actually kind of overlaps arches and canyonlands. So if you happen to be on a trip where you're going across to all of the parks of Utah, you can actually say, oh, hey, remember those rocks we saw in arches? Well, here we are in Zion, and we're actually seeing the same rock sequence. They may look slightly different, but they're actually the same. Capitol Reef is a huge chunk of it. And Bryce Canyon are the little melting candles, way up there at the top. So cool, right? But I'm just kind of throwing some random geology facts at you, which is great and all, but most people aren't going to actually get to see the rocks up close, especially in Grand Canyon, unless you're actually going to go on a hike down there. Geologists, we would prefer that you touch them, taste them, lick them, whatever. But, be careful though. But how can we really get the geologic story into people's minds? So I showed this actually 2 years ago. So for those of you who might remember, I'm not going to go into the uber details here. So again, hit me up afterwards if you would like to know a lot more details about the rocks themselves. But these maps come from a book, I've got it on the slide there, called Ancient Landscapes of the Colorado Plateau. You can definitely buy it online. And what these authors have done is they've reconstructed the Earth's surface at each point in time when these rocks were deposited. So I'm going to go through the grand staircase. I'm going to go through it fairly quickly, but what you're going to see is how the Earth right here in the Four Corners region has changed through time. So it gives people a visual. Like I will stand out there with this book. I've actually cannibalized it and pulled pages out of it, and I can show people, okay, when this rock that we're standing on was deposited, the Earth looked like this. And that, is recognizable to people, like, oh, okay, there's a coastline and there are mountains, and maybe there's a river and maybe there's a desert. And this is honestly why rocks are cool. So I'm the only one of my geology friends who does not have a rock collection, because they're rocks, it's a rock, okay. But you know why rocks are cool? Because they tell us what the world used to be like. Rocks are, in fact, storytellers. And I know many of you do this, right? You stand on the edge of Grand Canyon, you're like, the Grand Canyon is a book, and each layer is a page. And if you know how to read it, you can get this Earth's story. So I'm going to show you the Earth story from the entire grand staircase. Like, what does it tell us about this part of the world through time? And I'm going to go, again, fairly quickly, but long enough that you can see how the environments change. So look for, the yellows of a desert. Look for big river systems running through where there are certainly no rivers today. Look for giant mountain ranges where none of them are current, where no mountain range exists today. We're going to watch the Earth evolve. So in each map, you will see the Four Corners outlined just for reference. And then that red dot is where the Grand Canyon is located. But you'll see the entire Colorado Plateau here change through time. So starting at the bottommost layer of the Grand Canyon, the oldest rocks that are almost half the age of the Earth, moving forward in time, we see, and we've jumped forward away like a billion years into the future because of awesome geology. But, we see that sometimes we're on a coastline. Sometimes we're sort of underwater, like in a shallow sea environment. Sometimes we're very much underwater. So this part of the world, especially at this point in time, was actually an ocean. It's not an ocean anymore. It's a desert. But there are, the rocks tell us from the fossils, from the type of rock, from the chemicals that they're made of, they tell us the environment that they came from. And that is why rocks are cool. Over time, sometimes sea level drops and there are exposures of land. Climate will change, which means environments will change. So an area that may have been very wet and lush becomes a desert. So this is we're about halfway down into the Grand Canyon at this point. It was a very dry period. There's big deserts of wind-blown sand being blown around. And the development of different river systems, more deserts. We're working our way up to the top of the Grand Canyon here. And then at this point in time, this is where you're standing on the rim of Grand Canyon and looking down into it. The rocks you're standing on used to be at the bottom of an ocean. And that's why you will find fossils of sea creatures at the top of the Grand Canyon, right? And then they're at 7,000 feet, which is a whole nother problem. And again, we can talk about that later, but you have to explain how that happened too. Geology does rock. Moving forward in time, people have probably heard of Pangea, the point in time when all of the Earth's land masses were joined together as one continent. Well, we can reconstruct that as well. So if you ask, especially you got kids in the audience, like, hey, does anyone remember what Pangea is? Okay, sure. Well, here we are in Pangea times. We lived on the west coast of Pangea 230 million years ago. And that's us here on the Colorado Plateau at that point in time. But we can keep going further. So this book goes, again, all the way through the history of the plateau. So here's canyonlands, big river systems, an even bigger river system draining mountains to the south that definitely don't exist anymore. Shifting into more of a desert environment. Zion, okay, the Navajo sandstone, for those of you who have been out here, right? Those giant 2,000-foot walls in Zion is one giant sand body. This was a desert the size of the Sahara. And by the way, out here where I live in Vegas, right behind my house is Red Rock Canyon National Conservation Area. Same rocks, same age, same giant sand sea. That's the power of geology. That's what these rocks are telling us, right? We can look at these different constructions of now North America is starting to look a little more recognizable. The Atlantic is starting to open up. Pangea is breaking up. When you get to arches, more deserts, but there is the beginnings of an inland sea that starts to spread throughout what is now Utah. Capitol Reef, this is prime dinosaur time. The Morrison Formation is famous for dinosaur fossils. So I know in like near Colorado National Monument, there's this little roadside like interpretive area where they dug out a giant Apatosaurus like 100 years ago. It's just right there on the side of the road. So you can always find ways to show like the evolution of life. And who doesn't love dinosaurs anyway? So Utah's great for that. This giant inland sea that actually spread from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to the Arctic. So this is a period of time where sea levels were incredibly high. So then you can ask, well, why is that? Turns out the Earth was a lot hotter. So yes, climate change, but a different kind of climate change than the climate change we have now. Moving upward, like I said, I'm going through this quickly, but the book goes through really great detail. It's very accessibly written as well. This point in time is when the dinosaurs went extinct. So this is what the Colorado Plateau would have looked like at the time of the dinosaur extinction, 65 million years ago. But Bryce, you know, the weird shaped hoodoos, you know, that look like melting wax candles. You know, this is this is part of a different ice age than the most recent ice ages, but you can see that up in Utah, there were giant lakes that are, of course, no longer there. So the Bonneville Salt Flats are the remainder of those. You know, there's periods of volcanism. So the San Francisco peaks near Flagstaff, the La Salle Mountains near Moab. These are totally different geologic processes that you can, that are part of the story. That it's not just a bunch of, you know, sand and mud being laid down over time. There's all kinds of other geologic activity happening. Then there's the Colorado River itself. So if you are taking a tour to Grand Canyon, you can say, well, the Grand Canyon is both old and young because the rocks are really old, but the canyon itself, like 4 to 6 million years old, which hold that thought because I just said that's really young, but we don't even know what like a million years is. So we got to talk about time here in a second, all the way up into the modern day. So geology is a great storyteller. If you can get away from the like, well, this rock is this many millions of years old and it has these fossils and it's this thick. Like I literally taught geology for 15 years and I find that boring. So, you know, like there are more fun ways to do it. And I find these maps because people, you know, are very visual and they can visualize like, oh yeah, you know, here's a modern map of the world, right? Here's a modern topographic map of the Colorado Plateau region. Showing them how it's changed through time is a really great way to express like, okay, here's why these rocks are actually really cool. Other than that, they're very pretty to look at and they're very colorful, right? Especially when the sun is rising and setting. But rocks absolutely are stories. You just have to know how to read them. So that is one way that you can use science as a storyteller. But we are in some of the most spectacular landscapes in the country, in the world. So what else can we do? How else can we use, you know, the Southwest as a storyteller? Well, remember I just mentioned that, you know, I'm throwing around millions of billions of years as if we have any concept of what that means. I'm a geologist. I don't know what a million years actually means, but I talk about it all the time. So I find it very useful to put humanity in context of time. And so I know you can't necessarily read that depending on how big your screen is. I can send it to you. You can also just Google like geologic time in a day and you'll get all kinds of images like this. I pulled this off Google. But it is very useful to put Earth history into a scale that we can understand. Like we know what a second is, right? 1,000, 2, 1,000, 3, 1,000. We know what an hour is. We know what a day is, 24 hours. Okay, that's a scale that our brains comprehend. So if we put geologic time onto that kind of scale, suddenly all these giant numbers become more accessible because we really do want to know, like, where do we fit in on this story? Great, you know, the Grand Canyon's young. It's 4.6 million years old. Well, Were there humans around then? Let's find out. Okay, I know it's early. Well, okay, it's early here on the West Coast, but let's do some math. It won't hurt, I promise. All right, if we take 4.6 billion years and we make it equal to 24 hours, and I've done the math for you. And I'm happy to send you all of these slides, or I think this will be recorded or whatever, but hit me up afterwards if you'd like. You break it down, you figure out that an hour is like 192 million years, and a minute is 3 million years, and a second is 53,000 years. And then you look at the archaeological record. Homo sapiens, us, our species, we've been around for 200,000 years, plus or minus. That's 4 seconds. If the Earth is 24 hours old, we've been here for 4 seconds. Oh yeah, that's not that long. Oh my goodness. Okay, so yeah, the Earth is old, and all those maps I showed you, those took place over hours. And yet we show up 4 seconds before midnight of the next day. I'm going to call it New Year's Eve of 2020 because we need this year to be over with. Okay, but where do humans fit in? Well, in the Southwest, the archaeological evidence goes back at least 10,000 years, maybe even a little further. So on that scale of time, that's 0.2 of a second. And yet we find evidence of people everywhere, right? And so another story you can tell using the archaeological record is, how did people live here? Was the environment actually the same? It was a desert, but has the climate changed in that time? There is evidence that it may have been slightly cooler, slightly wetter. How can people survive in these harsh desert environments? That's part of the stories that we should be telling. We need to learn indigenous people's stories and tell them, or better yet, let them tell them. But at the very least, recognize that we stand on their land, on their ancestral homes, learn how they connected to their environment, because honestly, we need to learn that. Because as modern humans, we have definitely shifted in our relationship to the environment. So let's, and then just as a reminder of the whole Colorado Plateau region, I know a lot of you probably go through like Navajo Park, where Monument Valley is. Certainly if you drive anywhere around here, you are on, indigenous land. It is important that we recognize that and that we learn from their stories. And that becomes part of the stories that we tell, because we're all connected, right? So modern humanity, now I'm talking like industrial revolution is basically modern humanity, which we'll just call it 200 years. It is not that long. So if Homo sapiens have been here for 4 seconds and people have lived in the Southwest for 0.2 of a second, and that was 10,000 years, how long have we industrialized humans been around? I can't even say 4/1000ths of a second that fast. But I drill this into my students and I drill this into my guests, because now I want to shift into, how are we changing these places, right? What is our impact on them, of which we are a part, right? We want to take people out to these places. I guide people into the Grand Canyon on backpacking trips. I want them to experience it. But we do have an impact. And what does that mean? And why should these places be protected for the future? So you can tell conservation stories. And I'm mindful of the time and I want to leave time for questions. So I'm not going to tell the conservation stories. Again, feel free to hit me up, but I'll bet you're familiar with them. The California condors, right? Across the Southwest. There used to be 22, literally 22 left in the world. We've brought it back now to almost 500. We've introduced species where they don't actually belong. The bison and the elk all around Grand Canyon, not supposed to be there. They were introduced by humans. So what's the impact on the environment? Then of course there's us. We are all familiar with pictures like this, right? We are loving our public lands to death. How do we deal with that? I want people to go there. I want them to experience this. I want them to love it and want to protect it. But how do we tell the story without, these mob scenes? And then, of course, there's even more negative impacts, right? We're seeing this more and more, and it's heartbreaking. How do we educate people that this is actually not okay? That this is not a proper way to, relate to your environment, to connect with nature and our public spaces. Another way that you can connect people, tell the story of the night sky, especially for those of you from back east. Can you see the Milky Way from where you live? Probably not. I have had guests come out, that I've taken on tours in Grand Canyon. They have never seen more than the Big Dipper. And then here we are in some of these pristine dark skies, and they see the Milky Way, and reduces them to tears. And it brings back that kind of primal connection we have as Homo sapiens to our environment. So here we are out in the Colorado Plateau. It's one of those last few dark spots on the map, right, where we actually have clear, dark skies. And yes, I live in Las Vegas, not preaching here, right? I do not exactly live in a dark sky city, but I also don't have to go too far out of town to be able to see the sky. And that is an amazing way to connect people. Tell astronomy stories. Tell indigenous astronomy stories, because those are amazing, right? That gets people connected. And then, recognize, so this is 2018. I took this picture, and 2 hours later, it was smoked in. These were wildfires from California. Of course, this year was even worse. We're going to keep seeing that, right? We're going to keep seeing these kinds of impacts. Again, these are things that we have done in 4/1000ths of a second. So man-made pollution from power plants, our impacts from mining all over the Colorado Plateau, uranium mining in particular, which contaminates groundwater. In some cases, contaminates groundwater that is the only water source for indigenous peoples of the area. The Havasupai are fighting this right now in Grand Canyon. We've impacted this region in so many ways, right? The Colorado, that is its natural state, a red, muddy river. Most of the time, though, it runs green. And why is that? Oh, yeah, we've built these giant dams, the Glen Canyon Dam, Hoover Dam, which are monumental feats of engineering and should absolutely be taught about. But we should also talk about, well, what's the impact of that? Oh, yeah, without these dams, I don't live here. Neither do the people in Phoenix, neither do the people in LA, right? And a way you can connect the human story here, ask your guests, no matter where they are in the country. This might be mostly US, but ask them where they live in the country. Ask them if they have ever, oops, the pole's in my way. Ask them if they've ever eaten lettuce in the winter. Chances are they have. Ask them where their lettuce comes from in the winter. Almost all winter lettuce in the US is grown in the Imperial Valley in California. And the only reason it can grow in the Imperial Valley, California, is because of the Colorado River. So tell them that they're eating the Colorado River when they eat a salad in the wintertime. All of a sudden, they are connected to the Southwest, even if they've never been here. Well, they might be there now because you're taking them there. But, we actually all are connected to the Colorado River, even if you don't live down here. I am extremely connected to it every time I turn on my tap, right? That's the only reason I can live in Las Vegas. But we all are actually connected to, the environment in one way or another, and oftentimes in ways that we don't expect. So, couple thoughts just as we go, right? Like conservation is one of my big, passions. That's the story that I weave when I'm out in the desert. Yeah, rocks are cool. Great. It tells us a big picture story. But what's the human story? The fact that we have a connection to nature, which modern life has mostly removed us from. So how do we get that back? And we should definitely be listening to the stories of the people who are there, who are still there, have always been there, right? And what lessons can we learn from them? Okay, 40 minutes. Sorry, I know that was fast, but I think we still have time for questions. I know that these polls are running. So Emma, if you want to hit me up. So this
All
one
right.
poll.
I'm just going to unmute myself.
Sure.
So much. Yeah. So both polls went, and it's interesting to see. And in the chat, there were a couple questions about the books and about your book. So I found the link to the Ancient Landscapes of the Colorado Plateau. I popped that in there. And it's really, I mean, it's fascinating. I'm a Northeast New England kind of gal. So I see all the stars when I visit my parents in suburban Connecticut, or when I go up to the Berkshires, or when I go up into Vermont. And I've been to the Grand Canyon once, and it absolutely boggled my mind. I could not believe how big the space was. That's what, just, I could not believe it. So this is really interesting. So yes, everybody, please feel free to put your questions into the chat, and I'll look through them, and Dr. Giovanni will too. I think it was a lot of fun. Do you take your students into the field? Is that one of the things you do?
Yeah. So for the first 10 years of my career, that's all I did. It was, I used to run a 5-week field camp. I would take students all over Utah, Arizona, Nevada. So we would like live outdoors for 35 days.
Wow.
It was fun, but it was exhausting.
Yeah.
So now I teach environmental science here in Vegas at a community college. So really my field teaching is now the guiding I do in Grand Canyon. Which of course didn't happen this year, as we all are heartbroken about that.
Well, if you stop sharing your screen just a moment, then we can see you a little better. And a couple of people asked about getting copies of the slides, and so I think you'll make them available to Vaughn and Karen, and then we'll see how to distribute them to everybody. It was just fascinating. It was fascinating. Yeah. All right, so let me see. So people are talking about how they're going to try to incorporate geological stories in their tours. And some questions about the dam. Let me see. As the sediment builds up behind the dams, they will no longer be able to function to making electricity. And I mean, it's
and I think more urgent than the silting up problem is the drastically lowering of the lake levels. If you've seen Lake Mead and Lake Powell, they're about half full, which is terrifying. Las Vegas, the Southern Nevada Water Authority, recently completed a giant underground tunnel to the bottom of Lake Mead, so that, and this was a project 20 years in the making, but the idea is if the water levels drop so low that water cannot flow through Hoover Dam to make power, we can still draw water out of this, what they call dead pool, because it's our only water supply. It's the only reason Las Vegas is possible. But I am going to make a defense of Las Vegas. We recycle and reclaim over 95% of every drop of water in this city. So we are, because the casinos, of course, have a vested interest in still existing. So
of course. Now, there was a question about what books would you recommend for the astronomy stories or the indigenous astronomy stories?
Okay, so total plug, Grand Canyon Conservancy, they have a bookstore online, or they have their shop online. They have some books in their collection of like native stories. I have one downstairs and I'm not going to remember what the name of it is, but if you were to Google like either Navajo astronomy or Grand Canyon astronomy, you'll get some of those. So there are books with Navajo astronomy and the mythology, as well as Hopi and some Havasupai. So I would start there. I'm sorry I cannot. And the thing is, like, I know they're downstairs, but I don't know exactly where they are downstairs. So I can't run and go get them. But yeah, there are some great books that tell their astronomy stories, and they're fantastic. Yeah.
And is there something you would recommend for beginners, like me? I know nothing about the Southwest and for that kind of thing. Is there like one specific handbook that you would recommend more than anything?
Well, do you mean, so for geology, honestly, the Ancient Landscapes is a great one because it is very accessible. You know, you don't have to have a geologic background to be able to read it. Other ones, honestly, the Grand Canyon bookstore will give you a good selection.
And someone just popped it into the chat, and another person mentioned a good stories in a series of books called Keepers of the Earth. And that's another good one. And then somebody asked if you want to study geology but not get a degree in it. So I think you want to be more than just skimming the surface, but are there certificates or is there any kind of certification you can do? Or
A lot of universities often have what they call the open ed education programs, right? Like where you can audit a course without having to be enrolled as a student. So I would look into those, and nowadays, since we're all teaching online, chances are, like pick one of the big schools of the Southwest. I went to the University of Arizona for my undergrad, and I went to UCLA for grad school. So like I've literally been in the Southwest, for my entire adult life, really. Arizona State, Northern Arizona University is right there in Flagstaff. So I bet I would try the open ed programs as a way to like be able to audit some geology courses without having to be a student.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah. I have a friend who actually, she teaches at a community college in Maryland. She's a geology teacher, and she has, adult students coming into her class to audit. And so, because they just want to know more about their earth. So
community colleges are where it's at. And I taught at 2 universities before. Community college is where it's at.
I did too. So I know exactly what you mean. I know exactly what you mean. So let me see. Karen said that she'll get to get information to people as well. Okay. Oh, yeah. And Conservancy programs, I guess the Grand Canyon Conservancy has programs, and the park ranger interpreters too. And I'm sure the National Park Service has great information on their website.
Absolutely. And I know a lot of the parks, because of COVID, have been putting ranger programs online. Mm-hmm. So, and Grand Canyon National Park has definitely been having like live Facebook, feeds, like live Facebook programs with a ranger, and you can set an alert, to alert you when it's going to be on. But definitely, like, I have learned so much just anytime I'm in a park, state park, national park, whatever, and there's a ranger program, I go and sit in it, no matter what the topic is, because you will learn so much. In fact, a lot of the like archaeoastronomy, which is a thing that I've learned about, of the Southwest, have been from ranger talks. People like telling the stories of like how the Navajo, like Navajo constellations versus Hopi constellations, and how they, relate to the sky. So absolutely, if you are ever anywhere where there is a ranger talk happening, go listen to it. Yeah,
definitely. And somebody did ask about how the animals fit into the story. How do you bring those into your stories as well?
Right. So you can, of course, tell a conservation story of, say the condors, right? A species that we almost drove to extinction and have brought back. But you can talk about how invasive species have changed the ecosystem. So if you've ever been to the north rim of the Grand Canyon, it's more remote, it's more forested, and there are these bison out there. Bison are not native to Arizona, right? They were brought out there because people wanted to shoot bison on the north rim of the Grand Canyon. And they're doing very well out there because they have no natural predators. But now they've been studying the bison for a few decades, and they've seen the damage that they've done to this ecosystem because that ecosystem did not evolve along with bison. And so now the park is actually working on a removal program. Like they've captured a bunch of them. Like they've transported, I think there was a tribe in Oklahoma that wanted them. So they've been transferred off to Oklahoma, and they're trying to figure out how do we manage this species that does not belong here and is negatively impacting the environment. So you can look at sort of the ecology of, the area. Another story would be the elk in Grand Canyon, especially on the south. They're only on the south rim. Again, they were brought there because like people thought it'd be cool to hunt elk on them. It was like 100 years ago. Well, there are cougars, there are mountain lions in the Grand Canyon region. They do belong there. The elk have figured out that the cougars do not like to go into the village area, right, where all the people are. So the elk stay in the village area because the cougars are going to stay off in the forest. So like the biology studies of like animal behavior and how that has shifted due to human activity is fascinating. So you can look again at how have we, just by virtue of us being here and growing in population, how have we affected the behavior of other animals and then the impact on the environment.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. I mean, it's interesting. You're like, oh, we've got elk and bison. I'm like, we've got black bears and white deer.
Yeah.
We're in their space. Exactly. So we have to be mindful of that. So there's some great comments, including James Saunders, who writes, only cougars are in the bars. I mean, I know where his mind is. All right. And lots of, so many thanks and so many kudos and wonderful, wonderful presentation. It was really, really fascinating. And I'm definitely getting some of those books, and I'm definitely going to nag my family. We've got to get back out west when we can travel. the revenge tourism we're going to get. One more question. Let's see. Are the bison actually at the North Rim or just the Kaibab National Forest on the way?
Good question. They are technically in both. So you do actually cross into the park boundary, like 20 miles from where the North Rim Lodge actually is. So it's like this false hope. You've been driving forever and then you cross into the park boundary and you're like, oh my God, we're not there yet. So they are actually in the park boundary itself, but they may cross into the forest side too, just depending on wherever they are. Yeah.
All right. Great.
Thank you all for the very nice comments. I have been scanning them. I appreciate it. It has been super fun to talk to you all.
And I saw quite a few going by saying they want a fam tour. They're going to come on tour with you and they'd love a follow-up presentation. I think the follow-up presentation.
Absolutely. And this is our life now. As I mentioned, I teach on Zoom. So feel free to hit me up anytime. And yes, whenever you've got my contact info, if you guys are coming west, I will take you to the Grand Canyon. I'll take you around Las Vegas, whatever you'd like.
You can get all these East Coasts showing up on your doorstep saying,
well,
what is this?
This is my home. I love showing it off. So absolutely.
Well, I can tell you that we will reciprocate. We'll take you, I'll take you around the canyons of New York City. So we have our own canyons there.
Perfect. I've only been to New York once and I was 9. So I totally want to come back.
Oh, well, then you're due. Okay. All Organic just exploded. You have, all of our members are ready to take you around. You will not have a moment's peace.
Oh, fantastic. Fantastic.
Right.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. We'll be seeing you in the next session and have a wonderful, wonderful day. Thanks.